So does anyone else feel a little confused by any of that? I mean, it's no wonder the Sadducees would have brought that kind of question to Jesus, because now you can't quite get it out of your head after a while as you're thinking through some of these things, because we want to create this image of heaven that fits our image of earth, because it's what we have. It's the construct that we know. And yet it appears that Jesus is trying to get us to think beyond what we know in this time and in this age, and to know a greater truth about who God is, what God does, and how God reacts to situations in the world. And in fact, this didn't just start with Jesus talking to the Sadducees, but as we heard Leslie read us that passage from Job, it reminds us that people were already questioning what seemed to be just the given order of the day. And so Job is this person who, if you're like me, for many years you heard this classic example of Job, is that God and the devil got into an argument, and God turned Job over to the devil for a time just to let the devil wreak havoc on Job. And then they would see what the results were. And I have to admit, that's kind of close to probably how the book of Job is talked about. But I was actually at a conference recently, and somebody talked about that, and they said, really, the realistic way this probably turned out is that God had this council of angels that God would regularly work with. And in that council, somebody said, how do we know if people are really happy with us? How do we know, God, how do you know that people are really happy with you? I mean, take Job. Job has so much more going for him, but he probably sees this just as a result of the blessings of him being so good. So what would happen if things were taken away from him? Would he then turn against God, feeling like God is cursing him? And God said, that's actually probably something that would be helpful for us to know. And so he allowed this person of his counsel to go and let things not so glorious happen to Job, like the loss of possessions and the loss of family members along the way. But this was probably not that dualistic way we think about God being all good and the devil being all bad, and like the devil comes down in the red cape and the tail and the horns and so forth. It probably doesn't fit that image nearly as much as us trying to understand our human condition and trying to understand faithfulness in the midst of our human condition, because we know in our human condition that it's not always perfect, that some things go really well and some things become great challenges. But in the midst of that, we are still called into a relationship with God. And that's exactly what we see from Job. So we get into this point in the story of Job where he's lost things, and his friends keep coming to him, saying to him, what'd you do wrong? What'd you do wrong? Fess up. You got to confess. You got to tell everybody what you did. And I think they're just looking, like maybe they were publishing tabloids or something, and they're just looking for anything they can print that they can share. And Job is out there saying, I really don't know. I'm innocent in all of this. And they're trying to convince him that God is punishing him. And Job comes back with that wonderful statement about, I wish I could write this down, that these words would stand forever. And how many know these words as, I know that my Redeemer lives? Anybody know that phrase? That one's a big one, right? We're going to sing it actually in a couple minutes. But if we get back to the story about God and the counsel of God, the language changes to, I know that my Vindicator lives, because we're not probably looking at this sense of a devil worshiper or devil kind of person that people would give credit for bad things happening, nor are we actually looking at the kind of Messiah that we would see in Jesus necessarily. Not that sense of a redeemer, but simply that somehow things will come to light. That in the midst of all of this, somebody will say to Job, these bad things that are happening are not curses because of something bad you have done. Nor maybe were all the blessings that you had blessings because of how good you were. Maybe this is what it feels like to be human. blessings come and challenges come, and we live in the midst of all of them. And yet, in the midst of all of them, God is present. And that's what Job declares. That in the midst of all of this, Job declares that he is a person of God, that he continues to be a person of faith. And it doesn't matter what kind of challenges or scenarios are presented, he chooses to be a person who ascribes to a faith in God. And so it's in the midst of that then that we hear this story of the Sadducees coming to Jesus and talking to them about this story that really goes back to the laws that would have been in place so that a person could be cared for. And particularly if you go back to Moses' day, a woman would be cared for if her husband died, that a brother would marry her to make sure that she had some sense of being cared for. And then hopefully would have a child, and that child would care for her. And so the story of the 7 that go on and on and on, and then asking in heaven, of course, well, whose husband will actually be with her? What husband will actually be with her in all of that? Because if heaven is supposed to be this place of complete joy, I cannot imagine a woman having to have 7 husbands and thinking this is supposed to be joy for all eternity. That just doesn't seem to add up for people. And I think it also would have been awesome, though, as Jesus is trying to end this argument, if they'd have said, so whose husband will she be? If Jesus would have said, the 4th one, and just walked away. That would have been great, just to see what people would have said. But instead, Jesus takes this time to teach us about the fact that the construct in which we live and which we know, we don't have to hold on to that when we live into God's promises and the resurrection. We don't need to hold on to something that feels like we're going to be bound yet to earth, but God's going to open up new paths for us. And that's the joy of the resurrection that we're going to experience. What those are going to be, we have these images that come through some of the Old Testament and the New Testament writings that try to unveil what that's going to feel like to understand God's glory in new ways, in ways that just uplift us. But we realize we still are caught up in creating stories that fit what I know about my earthly existence. And sometimes I just have to let go of that, because God has something greater in store, and it's not something I know that I can describe for you. And yet, in the midst of that, Jesus comes and he talks to the people, and I love the way he talks about what will be and what we can know about God. And so he talks about going back to Moses and talking about what he talked about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and understanding what that means, and realizing that we talk about these people as if they're living, because that is how God sees them. That great line that Jesus says, God is not God of the dead. God is God of the living. And in the midst of that, we are called into a new life with Christ. And we have a couple of options there. We can wait that out if we want. We can just say, I'm just going to deal with my human existence, and that at some point, God's going to swoop in with this resurrection promise, and then I'll live into that. But I think when Jesus was talking to the Sadducees, and of course the Pharisees and others who would be around who would be hearing this, I think what he was trying to say is, why would you wait? If God is the God of the living, if God's promises are so real, why would we wait to live into them? Why wouldn't we want to live into those promises now? Why wouldn't we want to understand the God who is ready to be with us now? A God who's going to be present in all of life's challenges and in all of life's joys. God chooses to be with us because we are the living, breathing people of God. And in the end, God's going to have it all figured out somehow. And I don't have to try to create in my earthly existence a story that's going to fit what God has in store for heaven. But it doesn't mean I have to wait. It means that today I can be a person of great faith. Today, I can be a person who puts myself into God's service. Today, I can be a person who rests in God's promises that are true for eternity, but are true for me this afternoon. Because God is the God of the living. It's the God of the living that I choose to put faith in. It's the God of the living that I choose to serve. For the God of the living is a God that is with me in this life. And whatever it brings, I will declare the works of the Lord. And not just declare the works of the Lord, but maybe even get involved in them myself. Amen.